Welcome to Proving the Point, where we discuss important research papers that you should know about. Today, we're going to talk about this paper called Association Between Simian Virus 40 and Human Tumors. So it's about this virus, Simian virus 40, which might cause cancer in humans. Now, the reason this matters is because Simian virus 40, it doesn't exist naturally in human populations. Instead, it was accidentally introduced to humans through contaminated vaccines. So in the 1950s and 60s, scientists were developing vaccines to treat polio. And the way that they did that is they took cells from monkeys and grew them in a petri dish. So they isolated cells from live monkeys and they started growing them in a petri dish. And then they would basically isolate proteins from those cells to use to help make the polio vaccine. Okay, well, unknown to those scientists, the monkeys, a portion of them were infected with this virus that normally targets monkeys, the Simian virus 40. And so then they took those infected cells in their petri dish. When they made the polio vaccines contained trace amounts of this Simian virus 40. And so they gave that to humans. And it's thought that tens, maybe even 100 million people were unknowingly infected with Simian virus 40 out of contaminated vaccines. Okay, and now we're finding, after decades of study, they might cause cancer in humans. So the reason this paper matters, it should be obvious, but one, we aren't allowed to question vaccine safety, usually. So we saw that on full display with the COVID pandemic. You'd be censored from social media. You'd be kicked off the internet if you dared to question the COVID vaccine. Well, the reality is there's a long list of failures with respect to vaccines. So very serious mistakes were made many times with vaccines. And we're going to talk about one key example today, and maybe we'll do other examples in future videos. But in this case, they injected, again, tens of millions of people with a virus that may or may not cause cancer. So we'll talk about the evidence that it causes cancer and, again, why it matters. So another reason it matters is because we're told to trust the science passively. There's no such thing as an expert when it comes to molecular biology. The reason I say that is because to say that you're an expert in something implies that you know most of what there is to know about that field. But we as a species don't even know most of what there is to know about that field. So there's no such thing as an expert in it. Okay. So we don't need to passively trust people who have a degree in this field and let them tell us what to do. The reality is that scientists are swimming in ignorance, just like the rest of us. They're just blinded to it. All right, another reason this paper matters before we get into it is human cancer incidence has been increasing in most developed societies. And there's multiple potential reasons for that. So obviously our lifestyle is getting significantly worse. So people are more sedentary than before. We don't go outside as much. Our sleep schedule is disrupted. People are getting less sleep. They're more stressed than before. So there's artificial chemicals in our environment. There's all kinds of different reasons that cancer rates might be increasing in our society. Okay, but it doesn't help if, we're injected by viruses that might cause cancer. Okay, that could be an underappreciated cause of our increasing rates of cancer. So now we're going to get into the paper. So they start off by giving an overview of what Simian virus 40 is. So like I said before, it's a virus normally naturally found in monkeys, and it was accidentally administered to humans through contaminated vaccines, mainly polio vaccines, between 1955 and 1963. So again, in terms of how many people were infected, the answer is it's not known, but it could be somewhere between 10 and 100 million people worldwide were accidentally infected with Simian virus 40 through these contaminated vaccines. So a very, very serious mistake made by scientists. And most people aren't even aware that this happened. Most scientists aren't even aware that this happened. All right? And then they say, and they're going to talk about some of this later, but many studies have reported on the transforming and tumorigenic properties of Simian virus 40, that's SV40, which have been experimentally proven in cell cultures and animal models, respectively. So when they say transforming, they're referring to transforming of normal cells into cancer cells. Basically, that's synonymous with tumorigenic. So basically, what they're saying here is simply that there's a lot of animal studies and a lot of cell culture studies, so growing cells in petri dishes, that have shown that Simian virus 40 can promote cancer. Okay, and then they say these data have encouraged a significant amount of new research aimed at verifying if an association between simian virus 40 and different human cancers exists. So just as a preview, there's a lot of different studies in humans where they basically take a sample of cancerous tissue and then look to see if they can detect simian virus 40 inside that tumor. And many times they can. So it seems that there is a strong association between this virus and human cancer. Okay, so they start the review off by talking about the molecular details of this virus. We don't need to go into that. It's not really relevant to us. But they talk about its different genes that it contains in its genome. So that's what's in this table. And then like what role those play in contributing to infection. We don't need to discuss the mechanism of this virus at all. So then they attempt to give a plausible biological mechanism for why simian virus 40 might be causing cancer. And we're not going to go into the details because it gets very technical. But generally speaking, most viruses can contribute to cancer. And the reason for that is just like any other organism, the virus wants to replicate itself as much as it can. And in order to do that, it needs to basically steal your cell's nutrients and resources. So it needs to steal the substances your cells use to make their DNA so that the virus can make copies of its own DNA instead. Likewise, it needs to steal the substances your cells use to make their proteins, so that way the virus can make its proteins instead. So what a virus does typically when it gets into your cell is it rewires your cell to make your cell more willing to divide and grow. In other words, it tells your cell, hey, you need to grow. Then the cell starts to grow. It starts to build the resources it needs to grow. It starts to acquire more nutrients to grow. And then the virus basically steals a portion of that for itself. Now, you probably know that cancer is just uncontrolled cell growth. It's basically your cells dividing out of control. So they're excessively dividing. Viruses really like that because if your cells are rapidly dividing and growing, that means they have plenty of nutrients and resources available to them that the virus can basically siphon off and steal for its own advancement. So most viruses can actually contribute to cancer. But that's the basic idea of why simian virus 40, among other viruses, might contribute to cancer. But we're going to skip, again, the molecular details here because it's obviously much more complicated than that, but we don't really need to go into it. So we're going to skip down and we're going to talk about the animal models that have tested this. Okay, so as they said in the introduction, there's been a lot of animal studies that have shown that if you inject animals with simian virus 40, it causes cancer. So for example, they say when SV40 is experimentally inoculated in hamsters, it induces tumors of different histotypes depending on the route of injection. So then they talk about like different types of cancers that it can cause if it's injected into hamsters. All right, they also say that it's known to cause cancer in mice. In fact, it's so oncogenic, that means cancer causing, in mice that it's used to study cancer in mice. So they basically, if you're a researcher who wants to develop a drug to treat cancer, what some researchers do is they take SV40 and inject it into mice to give them cancer, and then they can test their various anti-cancer therapies on that. So they said these animals that are genetically modified and then injected with this virus, they develop all these different types of cancer. So we don't need to list them all off. You can read it for yourself, but basically any type of cancer. And they continue that on. Okay, whether we're talking about brain cancer, bladder cancer, bowel tumors, adipose tumors, lung cancers. The point is, there have been plenty of animal studies that have shown that if you inject simian virus 40, you can cause cancer. Okay, so that strengthens the argument that simian virus 40 might be causing cancer even in humans. It is worth pointing out that they say simian virus 40 infection into monkey cells tends to kill those cells rather than cause cancer in them. Okay, so even though it's causing cancer in hamsters and mice, it doesn't seem to cause cancer in monkey cells, which is relevant because obviously monkeys are closer to humans than hamsters. But nevertheless, this provides strong evidence that it could potentially cause cancer in living organisms like humans. Okay, so next up they talk about studies that have shown that simian virus 40 can infect humans. So again, they talk about how it was inadvertently administered to humans. It says hundreds of millions of people in North and South America, Canada, Europe, and Asia and Africa were vaccinated with both inactive and or live polio vaccines found to be contaminated with simian virus 40. So again, it could have been millions, tens of millions, or hundreds of millions of people. We don't know that were accidentally infected with simian virus 40, which might cause cancer. Okay, it's important to note that in the US, this was ended in 1963, but there were other countries where it continued on. So they say in the Soviet Union, it continued until 1978, and they say in Italy, it continued up until 1999, when they switched to an SV40-free polio vaccine. And troublingly, they say in other countries, the risk of SV40 contagion through polio vaccines is still a problem, as these vaccines are produced using SV40 positive monkey cells. In other words, there are still countries in the world today that are making these polio vaccines through the same old method that gave rise to simian virus 40 contaminated vaccines. So again, that shows you also just how slow science can be to adapt to a problem. And again, down here, they say it's thought that around 10 to 30% of polio vaccines were contaminated with simian virus 40. Okay, so they talk about how the specific simian virus 40 viruses found in humans overlap with those that were found in the vaccines, so it strongly suggests that they were delivered from the vaccines to the humans. They talked about how after the humans got infected, the virus might have spread to other people who weren't even vaccinated. Okay, so it says the virus spread for weeks in the stools of children vaccinated with the contaminated vaccines. In other words, these children were shedding this virus after they were vaccinated with these contaminated vaccines, and that could have presumably impacted the people around them. Another important issue is they say here other vaccines might have been contaminated. So they say against adenoviruses and hepatitis A, those vaccines were also SV40 contaminated. And there might have been one contaminated respiratory syncytial virus vaccine. And the people who took that vaccine, it says about 2 out of 3 volunteers taking that vaccine developed antibodies against simian virus 40, meaning they got simian virus 40 and then their immune system responded to it. We don't really need to dwell on the rest of this. They basically just talk about many different studies showing the presence of this virus in humans. They say it might be able to be transmitted sexually or through the fecal-oral route. So again, even people who weren't vaccinated, they can still be subjected to this virus and exposed to this virus, which might cause cancer. In terms of how prevalent simian virus 40 is in the population now, again, it's not entirely known, but they cite some other studies saying, for example, this one, looking at Swedish children, ages 1 to 13 years old, basically the prevalence of simian virus 40 antibodies, which is a direct indicator of them having been infected by simian virus 40, is 7.6 to 14% of that population. They say in early studies of low prevalence, 11% was detected in healthy individuals from Africa and the US. So approximately 11% of the US and Africa at that time were infected with simian virus 40. So the point is, even though it ranges widely in terms of like how much of the population is thought to be infected with simian virus 40, it's a relatively low level, but the point is it shouldn't have happened in the first place. It was a massive mistake on the part of science, and it affected people who weren't even vaccinated. Okay, so like I said, we don't need to focus on every single study here because they talk about a lot. But then they go on and talk about studies that have looked for an association or a link between simian virus 40 and human cancer. So first of all, they list off a bunch of tumor types associated with this virus right at the beginning. So it's been linked with malignant pleural mesothelioma, bone cancer, brain cancer, lung cancer, thyroid cancer, pituitary cancer, urothelial cancers, pleomorphic adenomas of parotid glands, choroid plexus tumors, and more. They go on to talk about breast cancer, colon cancer, lymphomas, all kinds of different cancer types. And they say, again, the mechanisms of simian virus 40 oncogenesis, again, that means formation of cancer, have also been studied. So they talked a little bit about that earlier. We didn't really cover it, but the point is there's layers of evidence that simian virus 40 causes cancer in humans. One, it's been shown in animals. Two, it's been shown in certain cell culture experiments. Three, it's associated with tumors in humans. And four, there's a lot of mechanistic evidence for how it could be doing it. All right, but we're going to skip through most of this part. They give this table, which basically covers a lot of different studies and different tumor types and whether or not they could find simian virus 40 inside those tumors. The rationale there is if this virus is present inside the tumor, it might have had a contributing role to the formation of that tumor. So we're not going to go through every single row of this table, but for example, with breast cancer, there was a study that tried to detect simian virus 40 DNA in breast cancer patients, and they found it to be present in 24 out of 109 patients, or 22%. So that's more than you'd expect based on chance. And there's other studies looking at breast cancer, a lot of studies looking at brain cancer. And again, you could either pause the video or go download the paper yourself and look at these percentages. But basically, in most of these cancer types, there's kind of a relatively high prevalence of this virus in those cancers. So again, remember, the virus is only thought to be in somewhere around 11% of the population, maybe even lower. Yet in people with cancer, it's consistently higher than that. Okay? So that is further evidence that the virus might be causing cancer. Okay, so again, they listed a lot of different studies in that table. And they say most of the reports mentioned in that table are related to association studies in which the causative role of simian virus 40 in inducing human tumors cannot be proven. So in other words, it's not like they were experimentally injecting the virus and then seeing if it causes cancer, because that's obviously unethical. It's association studies. They're looking to see, are the two related? Which, of course, you can't infer causation. You can't say from that the virus is causing the cancer, just that the two are correlated. But when you combine it with the animal studies, the cell culture studies, and the mechanistic information, it seems likely that it's contributing to cancer. Okay, one last thing that they talk about is that the simian virus 40 might contribute to other diseases besides cancer. So in their natural host, these monkeys, simian virus 40 infects the kidneys and causes kidney disease. Well, there's evidence that that might be happening in humans too. So they talk about how they've done kidney biopsies where they take a sample of kidney tissue and they find detectable levels of simian virus 40 in there. Okay. They say other studies indicate that simian virus 40 seems to be associated with neurological diseases, including multiple sclerosis. So it might be detected in the brain. It might impact neurological conditions. So that's pretty much it for the paper. The main point is obviously that science makes mistakes. Vaccine scientists make mistakes, and sometimes very important and big mistakes. And we should not be prevented from questioning them. We should not be treated like we're crazy if we don't want to get a newly developed vaccine, because again, this paper is from 2019. The mistake was made in 1955. And we still don't know if this causes cancer in humans. Like, it takes a very, very long time to do proper science, and the scientists fail repeatedly. And again, refusing a medication is erring on the side of caution in many cases, and we should not be treated like we're unreasonable for doing so. So the next time you get into a discussion about vaccine safety, it'd be a good idea to mention this issue, because I guarantee you the person you're debating has never heard of this. So we might cover some other vaccine mistakes that were made in the past, because like I said, there have been a lot of them. So we'll cover those in future videos, but thank you for listening.